Story number 1. Whispers of the Forbidden Game. The air pulsed with a murmur no silence should bear, its currents weaving secrets through the dim expanse, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood in the stillness, the ground trembling with a scent I couldn't place. Stone, something forbidden, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my curiosity. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the world was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to risk, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The murmur deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like challenges, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the wall. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The space wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the room stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the world was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the space's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my warning, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a guide, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze dipped, the room a canvas of men spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd dared here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to danger, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. This is a set of instructions for how to speak with the devil, which, as those of you with any sort of brains at all might note, is a patent moronic proposition on the face of it, one likely to culminate in any number of thoroughly unpleasant fates. Honestly, it would probably be smarter to publish your credit card number on Facebook or take up a career in crocodile wrestling. But then that isn't going to stop you, is it not, if you're sincerely interested at least? Technically, if you do everything just right, there's a fair chance you'll walk away scot-free. And that seems to be reason enough for some people to decide that it's a good idea, especially if you're the fate-tempting, thrill-seeking, scare junkie type or the desperate type. Which brings me to a point of clarification I ought to make. This is not a manual for making any kind of fan bargain. You know, the whole sell your soul type of deal. Although if you happen to bring it up in conversation, he certainly wouldn't be one to refuse following through with such a foolhardy bargain, however, would necessitate removing some of the protections which you will put in place for your conversation. And I don't think I need to spell out for you why that is a bad idea. If you're really mathematically impaired enough to want to trade something that will last an infinite number of years for something that might last 90 tops. There are plenty of other rituals out there for you to follow. This one, if performed correctly, should only allow the two of you to talk. This perhaps begs the question of why exactly you would want to speak with the devil in the first place. Maybe some of you just like the idea of making small talk with extremely dangerous occult entities. But for the sake of the human race, I hope most of you aren't quite that stupid. The short answer is he knows things that some of you may have a deep vested interest in finding out. I mean, he's not omniscient or anything much, as he might like to pretend. Otherwise, he is not God, but he's definitely got a supernatural advantage over the kind of knowledge any human would be able to obtain. For example, he probably wouldn't be able to predict when the next world war will happen or tell you the cure for cancer. But he could very well be able to predict the winning number of tomorrow's $500 million Powerball drawing, or tell you what deadly undiagnosed condition might be afflicting one of your loved ones. Of course, the Prince of Darkness doesn't just go around giving out winning lottery numbers to anyone who asks, and trusting any sort of information obtained from a being commonly described as the father of all lives is liable to land you in a worse situation than you were when you started. However, if you're really dead set on finding something out and you've exhausted all other options, there is a way to try to get accurate information out of the guy, you see. Like so many of the more urbane villains in popular culture, the devil has a bit of a penchant for games and gambling. Of course, the reason he likes them so much is because he almost always wins. Unless you happen to be a fiddler named Johnny, or are being represented by Daniel Webster, you're probably going to get your ass handed to you. But if you're determined enough to want to face the risks and the long odds, there's a certain game the two of you could play to try to win the information you need. First things first. Though we'll start off with the description of the summoning process, then get into the rules of the game, some tips for how to play, and finally, of course, the inevitable litany of arcane that might go horribly wrong. The space's pulse was a spark. Its whispers a truth that lingered in my caution, a truth that followed me to the guide. The air thrummed with a tension no calm should endure, its currents weaving secrets through the dim corners, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood in the quiet, the ground trembling with a scent I couldn't place. Stone, smoke, something forbidden, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my intrigue. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the world was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to challenge, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The tension deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like riddles, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the floor, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The space wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the room stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the world was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew that I was here. The vibration intensified, the space's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my guidance, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a guide, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of men spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd dared here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to risk, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. In order to contact your conversational partner, you'll need to go to a church at midnight. It doesn't matter what kind of church, large or small, old or new, liberal or conservative, just as long as you're sure that it will be empty. The last thing you will want is for some preacher to walk in while you're in the middle of this, for the sake of the preacher's well-being as much as your own. The process will probably work best if you try it on a new moon or a full moon or Friday the 13th or Halloween. The actual day is less important than the psychological effect it has on you. As long as you don't try it on Christmas Eve or something stupid like that, you should be fine. The time is important though. You don't have to start or end your ritual at exactly 12 and okay. Greenwich, atomic, Tim or anything. But as general rule of thumb, you want to show up a bit before midnight and have everything set up by no later than 10 or 15. Have to show up a lot before midnight if you don't know how you're going to get in. Shockingly enough, most houses of God tend to lock their doors at night, at least if no one's there to watch over them. And remember, we want empty. Got it. There are, of course, certain things you need to bring and certain things you can't bring for this ritual. You will need a full can of salt. You won't need to use all of it, but it's always better to have more than you need than to have less. 7 candles, red and white being preferred. Something to light the candles with. You would be shocked how often people forget this alt ritual. Or not. They are not going to magically light themselves a length of red string rope yarn or thread, a full-length floor or wall mirror. Ideally, you'll want to find one of these already present in the church. They're a bit unwieldy to be lugging round with you during a break-in, however. If there really aren't any there, you'll have to bring your own. You might also find it useful to bring some markers, pencil, paper, a flashlight, and any sort of tools that might be necessary to secure your entrance into the church. You will not be permitted to bring in any electronic or timekeeping devices. This includes all cell phones, smartphones, tablets, e-readers, MP3 players, PD calculators, wristwatches, pocket watches, kitchen timers, hourglass, etc. Seriously, it's worse than the SAT. If you're one of those people that has your smartphone practically wired to your brain, don't worry. You can bring those things with you to the church, as long as you leave them outside the room in which you will be doing the ritual. If you brought a flashlight, helpful for finding your way around without attracting unwanted attention, leave that outside too. Also, don't bring any sort of religious paraphernalia to protect you, especially if it pertains to the Abrahamic religions. And yes, if those goofy black cross earrings you're wearing are hanging right side up, they count if you have any kind of holy symbols like that with you. The devil will simply refuse to show up. Don't worry, you're not going in totally unprotected. In fact, most of the supplies with you are not for any sort of devil summoning ritual, but for your own protection. Old superstitions and folk magic remedies to guard oneself from evil. From what I know of it, the effects mostly based on the power of belief. So there are probably numerous other objects, artifacts, and procedures that would work just as well if you'd like to risk being left helpless at the mercy of the devil. In order to test that theory, feel free to experiment. However, for anyone without a psychotic death wish, I'd recommend sticking to the ritual as follows. Once you're sure that you have all the right supplies with you, make your way into the church and find some place to set up. It can be anywhere from the main sanctuary where the services are held to a Sunday school classroom to a walk-in supply closet. As long as you have a sufficient amount of open floor space and are certain not to be disturbed, set up your mirrors first. This is where the devil will appear when you summon him as such. You mustn't complete the summoning until you've laid down certain wards around it. First, surround the mirror with an unbroken circle of salt. If the mirror is hanging on the wall, lay down a semicircle around it, instead making sure that the salt touches the wall at both ends. Then wrap your red string around the mirror, several times the color. Red, especially red strings, is symbolic of protection in folklore of many cultures and religions. This is also why red candles are a good idea. Speaking of candles, set them up around the outside of your circle or semicircle of salt, spaced at relatively even intervals. No, you don't have to get out measuring tape and make it exactly perfect, but at least try to make it look as though it was set up by someone old enough to be trusted with matches. Light the candles in a clockwise fashion, being careful not to disturb the salt. If you break the circle, you'll have to start all over again. Once all the candles are lit and burning strongly, your protective wards are complete. You are now ready to proceed to the actual summoning. To do so, you must get the devil's attention and demonstrate your resolve by performing some sort of sacred religious act in the holy space. Turning a crucifix across upside down is fairly conventional, but it's not the only option. For example, I know a kid who once fulfilled this requirement by scribbling obnoxious graffiti all over the paintings of Jesus hanging in his Sunday school classroom. The nice thing about turning a cross upside down is that once you've finished your encounter, assuming you've survived it in one piece, you can just flip it right side up again, and no one's the wiser. Sidestepping the relatively minor, but irritating risk of having your Sunday school turn into a reenactment of the Spanish Inquisition for the next month and a half. The space's pulse was a weight. Its whispers a truth that lingered in my preparation, a truth that followed me to the ritual. The air trembled with a strain no peace should defy, its currents weaving secrets through the dim ward, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood in the quiet, the ground trembling with a scent I couldn't place. Stone whacked something forbidden, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my resolve. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the world was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to focus, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The strain deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like games, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the air. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The space wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the room stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the world was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified. The space's pulse, a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my strategy, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a guide, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of men spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd dared here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to wits, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. After you finish doing whatever offensive thing you decide on, shut all the doors to the room and turn off all the lights so that the space is lit by only the candles. Face the mirror and stare deeply into it, concentrating on your desired outcome. There are no incantations, no arcane strings of Latin you have to recite. Just look into the mirror and wish as hard as you can for the devil to appear there. After a few moments of this, when you feel ready, close your eyes and count to 10, then open them. If all is gone correctly, you will no longer see your own reflection. You will be looking at the devil, or at least looking at the way the devil has chosen to appear to you. Chances are he won't look like your conventional red horn demon with goat legs and a pitchfork, nor any other sort of terrible apparition. No point in scaring you off now. Better to lure you in, make you feel safe to that end. He takes on the appearance of a fairly average, nondescript human being. If anything, he's prone to vanity and will lean toward the more attractive end of the spectrum. The only really frightening part of him will be his eyes. No matter how hard he tries, he can't hide the sinister gleam smoldering deep within them, the malevolent amusement and hunger like the eyes of a spider contemplating a fly struggling in its web. They're supremely confident, those eyes confident, and without pity. Don't look into them too deeply, or you'll begin to feel helpless and paralyzed with dread, losing your hope and your will to fight, since you'll probably be just standing there staring at him in shock for a few moments, having on some level expected the ritual to fail. He'll initiate the conversation by asking you, what is your desire from him? If you can gather your wits enough to string together a coherent sentence, you should respond with something like, I wish to challenge you in a game of question and response. Even if you don't get the words exactly right, he'll know what you mean, and he'll accept your request with a wide, predatory grin of anticipation. He's been playing this game for a long time, you see, and he's very good at it. Most humans, on the other hand, are very bad at it. This gives him a chance to, at the very least, thoroughly mess with your mind. And at most, well, we'll save that part for the litany of that could go wrong. You'll have to play it very smart to avoid justifying his expectations. The general rules to the game are very simple, with a few caveats that can make things more complicated. He'll begin by asking you a question. He always initiates the game. It can be anything from a piece of obscure trivia into a riddle to an extremely personal inquiry. Don't worry, you won't be immediately plunged into hell if you get the answer wrong or anything like that. As a matter of fact, he won't even tell you whether you got the answer right or wrong. After you've answered his question, you get to ask him one in return. Now, here's where the consequences of your response come in. If you answered his last question correctly, he will respond to your question as honestly and accurate as he is able. However, if you answered it incorrectly, he is free to lie to you as he sees fit. Perhaps if you've asked him something you're better off not knowing, he'll tell you the truth about it anyway. More likely, he'll feed you the most insidious, damaging lie he can come up with. Either way, after he's responded, he'll ask you another question, and the process will repeat over and over until you decide to call it quits. Now, you may be sitting there thinking it sounds fairly easy to get the information you need. All you need to do is wait for a question you can answer correctly, and then take the opportunity to ask him what you really want to know, ignoring everything else he said. Well, it's not that simple. The devil will never give you an easy question, one that you can be completely sure of the answer to. He may instead give you questions that you have some vague knowledge of, that you think maybe you know the answer to, but aren't really confident, thus forcing you to endlessly second-guess yourself, obsessing over whether or not you can trust the information that he gave you next. Perhaps you'll think what he said was a lie, wish it was a lie, but be eternally consumed by doubt, unable to fully convince yourself that you were wrong. Or perhaps you'll have made a choice based on the information he gave you, and perhaps that of others as well rests entirely upon whether or not you were able to correctly recall some arcane piece of trivia that you don't even remember. Now, you'll never remember the exact questions the devil asked you. By the way, that would make it too easy for you to go back and check your responses. The space's pulse was a weight. Its whispers a truth that lingered in my challenge, a truth that followed me to the game. The air groaned with a weight no mind should bear, its currents weaving secrets through the dim void, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood in the stillness, the ground trembling with a scent I couldn't place. Stone, ash, something forbidden, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my caution. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the world was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to strategy, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The groan deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like traps, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the air. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The space wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the room stretching ahead, its surface bending, as if the world was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick, with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, The space's pulse, a drumbeat under my feet. It silenced a predator. I carried my wisdom, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a guide, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of minds spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd dared here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to peril, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. Or maybe instead of testing your knowledge, he'll ask you something personal, something you even lie to yourself about. You'll answer back to him thinking, you've gotten the question right. No, I don't resent my sister. Yes, I would turn the money into the police, but he'll know better. He'll know better than you do that you're lying, and he'll lie to you in return. And you'll believe him. You'll believe him until you are no longer able to deceive yourself. And by then it might be too late. Or maybe he won't even give you a chance to get an accurate response at all. Maybe he'll ask you an endless string of completely impossible questions, making you more and more frustrated and disheartened as you realize you'll never be able to force him to tell you the truth. Questions like, what was the exact height of Mount Everest in centimeters in the year 666? Or what is the ARP speed velocity of an unladen swallow? Although knowing his sense of humor, if he ever passed the latter, he might consider African or European a correct response. There are a couple of ways to short-circuit his particular strategy. However, additional rules and courses of action that make the game more interesting and prevent you from being stonewalled completely. Although in all honesty, he probably wants for you to try one of these options anyway. The first option is to ask him a riddle instead of a question. If you somehow manage to stump him and he answers the riddle wrong or gives up, he'll be obliged to give you a truthful response to your next question if he answers the riddle correctly. Once again, don't worry, he won't pounce on you like a sphinx or drag you into hell. What will happen is that he will get a pass, allowing him to lie in response to one question that he would otherwise be obliged to answer truthfully. Honestly, if he gets a pass, you might as well just give up and quit the game right there. It's nearly impossible to determine when is telling the truth under the best of conditions. Adding another layer of complexity by constantly trying to figure out when and if he's using his pass, it's about enough to make any normal person's brain explode. There's no way. Just forget it. The second option for you is to take a dare from him. If you accept it and vow to follow through, then once again, he'll have to answer your next question truthfully. If you choose instead to reject it, he'll get another pass now before you freak out and reject that whole idea completely. You should know that he won't ask you to do anything overly dramatic or unspeakably evil, like blow up a hospital or murder somebody. As a rule of thumb, most dares won't involve direct loss of life or any major felonies. However, they certainly won't be easy, inflicting severe pain on yourself, doing something that terrifies the out of you, cutting off a treasured relationship publicly, humiliating yourself for someone you love. All those things and more things you might not even be able to imagine are completely on the table if you're willing to go that far. To put yourself in that kind of position, you'll get your answer. However, If he manages to come up with the one thing you know you simply can't or won't do well, then once again, you might as well just quit. One last thing. Don't think you can't just tell him you're going to do something and then not do it. If you accept a dare and then don't follow through with it, well, let's just say there will be consequences. Just suck it up and keep your promise no matter what it was. Trust me, you're better off that way. Finally, when you've either gotten the information you wanted or given up on it completely, you may end the ritual by simply thanking the devil for accepting your request, bowing politely at the waist and bidding him farewell. The surface of the mirror will seem to swim and flicker for a moment, and then you'll be looking at your own reflection again. Only when you're absolutely sure that you are looking into your own two eyes again may you turn away from the mirror, flick the lights back on, and begin dismantling your protections. Now, and this is important, even if you haven't gotten the information that you wanted, you must end the ritual in this manner before 6 minutes have elapsed. Well, I suppose that technically you have 66 minutes and 6 seconds subtle, right? But if you're seriously going to try to cut that close without any kind of timekeeping device, you're probably screwed anyway. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you keep to this time limit. I'll save the reason behind that for the end, but don't skip ahead. I've still got a few important tips on how to play. The space's pulse was a weight. Its whispers, a truth that lingered in my strategy, a truth that followed me to the rules. The air shattered with a dread no hope should face. Its currents weaving secrets through the dim void. Its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood in the silence, the ground trembling with a scent I couldn't place. Stone, fear, something forbidden, something that clung to my soul, something that knew my warning. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the world was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to peril, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The dread deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like fates, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the air, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The space wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I glanced back, the room stretching behind, its surface bending as if the world was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my mind, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the space's pulse a drumbeat under my breath, its silence a predator. I carried my caution, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a guide, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow it. The breeze faded, the room a canvas of mind spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who dared here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to consequence, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. 1. Be very careful what sort of personal information you give out. Try not to talk about yourself, especially your emotions and problems, any more than absolutely necessary. This guy knows human psychology like the back of his hand and will get inside your head. It's like talking to Hannibal Lecter. Give him enough to work with. Even if you don't believe a single word he says, he will still find a way to with your mind, like nobody's business. If anything he asks makes you even remotely uncomfortable, do not hesitate to lie through your teeth. There will be plenty of other questions. 2. On a similar note, try to keep the game on track and moving briskly. Unstructured interactions of any kind are to be avoided. Chances are that at some point he will try to draw you off on a tangent, discussing something that fascinates you, analyzing a response you've given him, or finding some other excuse to speak at length without moving the game forward. This is not only a waste of valuable time, but also another excellent opportunity to mess with your mind. 3. If you choose to give him a riddle, use one that you've made up yourself. If your riddle has ever been written down anywhere at all, from the page of The Hobbit to some long-lost tome of ancient magic, he will already know the answer that said it still has to be a legitimate riddle with an answer that makes logical sense. From some angle, you can't just ask something like, "What's green, has 10 legs and hops?" Then claim for some inexplicable reason the answer was marshmallows. Nor can you ask him a straight question like, "What have I got in my pocket?" He probably already knows that anyway. There are no hard and fast rules to determine whether a riddle makes sense or not. But you're a reasonable human being. Your ancestors ate from the tree of knowledge. Please, for love of crap, use common sense. 4. If you choose to take a dare, there is a slight chance that the devil will ask you to do something seemingly easy. Deliver a letter, for instance, or scribble a 10-digit number in a public restroom stall. If he does ask you for something like this, and you even have a shred of common decency and you do not accept, chances are that he's using you to further some sinister plot, one liable to ruin a lot of lives and harm a lot of people. Who knows, maybe you're the type of person who really doesn't mind throwing an unknown number of total strangers under a bus to find out what you want to know, but at least be aware that that is what you're doing. 5. Last, but not least, be wary of the time. It might be helpful to do some practicing beforehand and get a feel for how long an hour is without a watch. The devil will probably put off discussing the things you're most keen with to find out for as long as he can. And as you near the 66-minute deadline, he'll start trying harder and harder to distract you, captivate you, and otherwise keep you playing until it's too late. He'll string you along, feed you little glimmers of false hope, and keep you thinking just a few more minutes. I'm almost there. Don't fall for it. Don't go over the time limit, no matter what. Now, you might be thinking that this game really doesn't sound that dangerous so far. Threats of psychological damage rarely seem to carry the same as threats of physical damage, even though their costs are often just as great. Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but the game is far from safe. There are plenty of ways for you to seriously screw yourself over, both physically and mentally, not to mention spiritually. And it's with these that I will conclude, in the vain hope that they may make some sort of impression first while you're speaking with the devil. Do not let him out of your sight. Keep staring into the mirror. No matter what happens, he will undoubtedly try various tricks to make you look away, You will hear a noise behind you, feel eyes in the back of your neck, see shadowy phantoms writhing in the depths of the mirror. A cold breath will blow upon you from behind, smelling like the crypt. A dead silence will settle, only to be interrupted by a loud smack directly behind your head, giving you about the worst jump scare you've ever had. Hell, the devil may even abandon a measure of his own dignified facade and give a sudden jump of feigned shock, shouting loudly and pointing behind you with a very convincing look of terror on his face. Whatever he might test you with, you must not look away from him. If you look away, if you lose sight of him completely, even for 1 second, you will look back at the mirror and find him gone. Well, not gone out of the mirror, here in the room with you. Exactly how much of your body the police will find the next morning and what state it is in will depend entirely on the sort of mood he's in. The same goes if you break any of the protections you laid down before beginning the ritual, interrupting the circle of salt, letting the red string unwind, knocking over a candle, or letting one go out. Any of these things will free him from the mirror, and then, well, you're all a bunch of creative horror junkies. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks on a different topic. You may reach a point in the game, probably after a series of maddeningly impossible questions, where the devil asked you the deceptively simple question, what is your full name? You must not give it to him. Names can be things of great power. Although the devil will, of course, already know your name, telling it to him yourself is akin to inviting a vampire into your home. Your name is deeply synonymous with your own inner self. Thus, giving him your name is powerfully symbolic to giving him yourself. And if you are foolish enough to make that mistake, all of your protections will be for naught, and he will seize upon your unwitting offer with malicious glee, stealing away your soul and dragging it back with him into hell. At least this way, the police will find a complete identifiable body. As a matter of fact, your vacant shell will be totally unblemished, seemingly having dropped dead of sheer terror last. But certainly not least, there's the matter of what happens if you go over the time limit. This is arguably the worst thing you can do. You won't think so. At first, the devil will give you no indication that you have in fact exceeded the time limit, and you will conclude the ritual as if nothing has gone wrong. Perhaps as the devil's image in the mirror trembles and gives way, you'll see a particularly triumphant smirch flash across his face. But this will be easily dismissed as your imagination. You'll turn the lights on, gather your belongings, and go to leave the room. But when you open the door, you'll see nothing. That's right, nothing. Just a flat white void extending infinitely in all directions. Only the room which was reflected in the mirror will now exist incidentally. If you turn back around to face the mirror again, you may catch a glimpse of your own reflection. Perhaps it will even turn and favor you with a smirk and a cheeky wave before sweeping out the door and into the perfectly normal church hallway outside. As you may have already figured out, you yourself are no longer in the church. Your soul is now trapped in the mirror, and the devil has taken the liberty of possessing your body. Now that you are no longer using it, pound on the glass and scream all you like. You'll never get out on your own, and no exorcist can help you. But don't worry, it's not like you're in hell, right? At least not necessarily. What you have to understand, see, is that a human soul stripped bare of its flesh is a deeply volatile and vulnerable thing, especially when trapped in the land of the living. You are now an entity of purely mental properties, and as such, the barriers between what is real to you and what is imaginary have been completely dissolved as you fill that reflected room with your anger, your sorrow, your fear at being trapped. These emotions will begin to coalesce as given form by your mind. If you're not particularly imaginative, these creatures may not be too terrible, may not be able to inflict too much horror and pain. With time, you may even be able to teach yourself to get rid of them. If, however, yours is a mind haunted by monsters, a mind that is vibrantly creative and imaginative, and more than usually twisted, well, there's no telling what horrors might come crawling their way out of the maelstrom, tasting sweet release from the confines of your subconscious, hungering for your terror and suffering. They will refuse to be banished, dragging you kicking and screaming into an endless positive feedback loop of pain and fear. Needless to say, if you're a regular patron of stories like this, you're probably pretty well. There's only one way to find release from the mirror and the world that you've created. They say that if you call to the devil once more and ask him to free you from the mirror, he'll be willing to take you out for the usual fee. Of course, who knows how maybe if your imagination is twisted and powerful enough to create a personal hell that leaves you begging for the real thing, those talents might be put to good use. There are over 7 billion people in the world. After all, even the devil himself can't be messing with all their minds at once. Talented help is always appreciated, of course. The quarrel to being trapped inside the mirror is that the devil now gets to do whatever he wants in your body until sunrise. At around that time, your body will mercifully drop dead from the strain of the possession. Autopsy will probably identify the cause as some kind of coronary event. Don't be too relieved, though. He's perfectly capable of stirring up plenty of trouble in those few hours. For instance, he may decide to do something big and dramatic, like purchase a large meat cleaver and go on a murder spree, starting with the names in your address book and working his way out to complete strangers if he has time. Or perhaps he'll focus on only one person, someone who trusts you completely, using your persona to get him or her alone and vulnerable. And then, well, no need to describe it here. Once again, I'm sure you can think of a few things starting to see why I call this the worst outcome yet. Of course, there's also the chance that he won't lay a finger on any of your loved ones, instead deciding to do something a little more subtle, more insidious, like drop off a few nondescript unmarked packages on certain doorsteps in dangerous parts of town, or locate a particularly dusty and aged yellow text in the storeroom of your local library and intentionally misfile it with the young adult literature section, or whisper 7 very choice words into the ear of the distracted-looking young redhead waiting for the 3 o'clock subway train. Or maybe he'll decide that in this age of waning superstition, not enough people are getting interested in his games, and the knowledge of them is in danger of being lost. Maybe he'll decide he needs to get the word out a bit more, do a bit of networking, attract some new suckers, challengers. Maybe he'll take a quick peek at your browser history and see where the impressionable, curious minds are hanging out these days. Maybe he'll even record a quick tutorial in modern parlance rather than some unscrewable, obsolete, demonological text and post it on the internet to see how many bites he gets. Well, maybe I really shouldn't have gone there, but if you've made it this far without shying, a little twist at the end isn't going to put you off. Is it, dear listener? I'm sure there are plenty of intrepid adventurers among you with burning questions you'd like answered, and you're all the SMSM bunch. You know the pitfalls, you know the conventions, you live and breathe this sort of thing. Don't. There's no way you'd fall into any obvious traps, right? You're not some Dick or Jane off the street. After all, you'd bring a whole new level of competition. You would, oh, excuse me, just a moment. I think I hear someone calling from me. What you want out that badly already must be one hell of an imagination you've got on you. Perfect at music. Music. The space's pulse was a weight. Its whispers a truth that lingered in my warning, a truth that followed me to the end. Story number 2, Echoes of the Fading Bond. The air trembled with a silence no heart should bear. Its currents weaving secrets through the dim room, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the window, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Wood, dampness, something lost, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my grief. The house stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to loss, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The silence deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like memories, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the sill, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the house was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the house's pulse, a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my sorrow, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a brother, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of lives, spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd been here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to memory, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. We'd all known Dennis had less than a week, and we'd all braced ourselves for all the good that would do. This was going to tear us apart and leave a ragged, gaping hole in our lives, but that would be it. It would fit within our understanding of things, and we could all assume that he went wherever we thought people go. That would have been so much easier, so much less troubling than what actually happened. Dennis had been diagnosed with cancer a couple of days after his 10th birthday, and it was all downhill from there. There was never an upswing, never an opportunity for surgery. All of the scans showed the same thing. The oily black webs having grown larger and denser. The fact that we were twins and had looked identical right up to when he started chemo just made it worse there. I was right beside him, a perfect image of what he used to be before his hair fell out and his color drained and his cheeks sunk down into a skull. An emaciated ghost constantly contrasted with what he should be, and then, finally, the doctor shut the case, snuffed out the last wisps of hope. Dennis will most likely not last more than 4 days a week at most, so we'd all set up camp in his musty room at the hospital. The walls were freckled and PE green. The only light slanted in from between the shutters, glaring bars stretching out across the floor to end just short of Dennis's bed. The staff managed to bring in another simpler bed for me. My parents slept in the old wicker chairs. Dennis looked really bad at this stage. You could as good as see a skull. We all wanted to talk to him. He had to make the most of whatever time we had left. But he slept for most of the day, and when he woke up, there'd just be silence. Nobody knew what to say. There were no right words, and there was this underlying fear that the moment anybody interacted with the situation, they'd somehow make it real, and it would hit everyone. The first sound would knock us all off the tight RPP, and we'd fall into tears and chaos, and we wouldn't be able to pull ourselves back out. So there was silence, my parents occasionally forcing smiles that never made it to their eyes. The third day was when it finally happened, and Dennis began to shake feebly as the dry, crackling sound rose up from his mouth. My parents exploded out of the chairs, my mother heading straight to Dennis, grabbing his shoulders and pleading at him to stop it and be all right. My father was at the room door screaming down the hallways for help. The doctors and nurses at the hospital changed lately. They started treating Dennis differently. Before, the resuscitations were always these frantic, desperate efforts like 100-meter sprints. There was a desperate desire to succeed in every single moment. Now it was different, more like a steady jog. These were people who were going through the motions, taking off things they were meant to try from little checklists in their minds. I don't think it would have made a difference either way. The cancer had finally tipped over, and his system just couldn't shoulder it anymore. They called it and left, offering their condolences and saying they'd take the body away when we were ready. The doors clicked shut behind us. Me, Dad, Mom, and Dennis's corpse. We all inched closer up to the side of his bed and just looked. My mother cracked, breaking into great howling tears. My father pulled her close, trying to keep it together, but losing it in his own way. No sobs from him, just the occasional tear running down his face and sharp breaths bursting through his clenched teeth. I was just quietly staring at Dennis's face. We all stood there for a long time. I finally realized that this wasn't just one thing. This wasn't a single event. For the first time, my mind started running away with itself and unfolding all the endless implications of this, every one of them causing my gut to sink, and for me to miss him so much. Even though he'd just been here, I was never going to talk to him again. He was never going to laugh at me again. We were never going to eat dinner again. We were never going to school together again. We were never going to be in the same class in school again or talk during classes at school again. It just kept going and going as I realized that this wasn't just one person I'd lost a million things, something that was meant to be. This constant presence was gone, and nothing would ever be as good as it should be. Again, everything was going to be sewered by the certainty that I wouldn't be doing it with him, or that I wouldn't be able to tell him about it later. It had only ever been a childish assumption that any of that would happen. The house's pulse was a spark, its whispers a truth that lingered in my loss, a truth that followed me to the silence. The air thickened with a chill no warmth should defy, its currents weaving secrets through the dim space. Its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I sat by the bedside, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Wood antiseptic. Something lost. Something that clung to my breath. Something that knew my fear. The room stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to despair, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The chill deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like echoes, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the sheet, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the house was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified. The house's pulse a drumbeat under my feet. Its silence a predator. I carried my hope, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a brother, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of lives and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd been here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to connection, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. I was the first to see his lips quiver. Mom, Dad, his lips are moving. My parents froze, still clasped against each other. My mother curled over, supported by my father. We looked down as his lips continued to quiver. My parents went quiet again. They must have been trying to hold back hope, assuming that it was some kind of nervous tech. But it kept going, and finally, in a dusty horror voice so faint it was like you were hearing it on the wind, he said, "My name, Harry." My father sprinted across the room, yelling for the nurse to come back. My mother was clutching her mouth and stumbling back from the bed. The workers tumbled back in and went through the checklist and shocked him with the defibrillators a few times and reached their verdict. "We're sorry, he's still dead, but I heard him talk," said my father in a small, pleading voice. "Look, it could be gas escaping," but said my father before a tiny scraping sound cut through the room. Everyone turning towards its source, it was coming from Dennis, halfway between a sigh and a croak. "Harry, it's all so dark, so cold, so dark, and it's pulling at my insides, and it's taking me down." A moment later, nurses started on their rounds again, but this wasn't some perfunctory run through the checklist. You could see it on their faces and how hurried their movements were. They didn't know what was happening. They weren't even sure they were doing the right thing. They moved on to the defibrillator again, sending crashing waves of power down through Dennis's chest. Before listening with the stethoscope, it doesn't seem to make any sense. One was mumbling. After 10 minutes, they all just stepped back. They'd run the checklist out. Nothing had happened. What's happening? My mother screamed one of the men. A doctor, I think, answered, "Nothing's happening. We try to pump in oxygen and it does nothing. There's no pulse. And we can't induce one for more than a second or two. The body's temperature's down 3 degrees. He's deceased, but we heard him." I said, "I know, but he's dead." The dry grating came again, and everyone shut up. "Please, Harry." "Where are you?" I walked over to his side. I wasn't relieved. He was talking. I was only afraid this was wrong. I wanted to run. I wanted him to just be gone so I could cry with my parents and be done with it. But I kept walking and put my hand on his bony, cold, and clearly dead hand. "I'm here," I said. "I can see gray, a little bit of gray, but it's so far away. I don't see it. I feel it. I feel it. And I never knew something could be so far away. I'm already so far down. But I need to go so much further to get to the gray." I didn't know how to respond, so I just stood there and listened to him talk about the darkness and the distant gray smudge. Sometimes he'd answer me, sometimes he wouldn't. A lot of stuff happened around me in the next few hours. Everyone who worked at the hospital must have been in and out. Even my parents started to leave, sometimes when they accepted. I was the only one that seemed to be aware of. Dennis was looked at by every type of doctor they had in there, and nobody understood. They started moving him around on a stretcher, taking him to the equipment. They just couldn't bring to him. I had to come along. I was the only one who could keep him talking. It was a long time before anything was turned up. They had gotten desperate and had put Dennis into an fMRI machine. They'd fully prepped a corpse and put it in a machine for the living. My entire family was in the room. A cold, confused fear settled in my gut, making me feel a little bit like throwing up. I think we got something," said the technician who was looking at the monitors. "Please just tell us what's happening," said my mother. She'd moved past terror and hope and was now, above all else, exhausted. Her red face slack and empty look. This scan looks for where the blood is in the brain. Well, the thing is that none of the blood in the brain is moving. We know that from the pulse. But something is happening in there. Something the machine can only pick up little, but there is some kind of activity. And now I can't be sure, but I think the activity is clustered around some of the parts that control movement. Everything else is totally dead. He's obviously conscious. He's using complete sentences. But what?" said my father. "But it's like whatever's doing the thinking is somewhere else, still interacting with the stuff that does the talk." "That's exactly right," came a voice behind us. I looked over my shoulder and saw an old man in a gray business suit. He had a well-trimmed silver beard and was all around a strange contrast to the gloomy chaos that engulfed the hospital. "Who are you?" said the technician. "I'm Daniel Cohens," he said, handing the technician a crisp business card. "I'm with the Oris Institute. We're a semi-private medical research body, and we've dealt with a few cases similar to this one. The hospital president has already agreed to let us look into this. Almost invisibly, a number of men moved in behind Cohen, and were now making their way over to the technician. These men will help explain the confidentiality situation surrounding issues like this. We'll handle the boy from here. More men, these ones in pure white scrubs that had a strange logo on the left breast, got Dennis back on the stretcher and led us into the hallway. We followed wordlessly, never thinking to say anything, because at least these new people represent new possibilities, a completely new road that might lead to an explanation. The house's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my fear, a truth that followed me to the theater. The air swelled with a pressure no mind should endure, its currents weaving secrets through the dim space, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the table, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Metal, old something lost, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my dread. The room stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to confusion, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The pressure deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like voices, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the edge, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the house was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the house's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my connection, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a brother, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of lives spent and lusts, its corners holding echoes of those who'd been here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to questions, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. They rolled Dennis into an operating theater, and my mother gasped. "Look, just what are you doing?" said my father in a husky voice that made it obvious he was still holding in tears Cohen's, who had been striding alongside the stretcher with a speed that belied his age, had stopped once we got to the theater and was now taking deliberate care to look us all three in the eyes. We were still in the hallway, the operating theater door shut beside us. He answered in a low, comfortable tone, "We're not performing surgery. It's just the quietest part of the hospital, and there are no distractions in there. We want nothing more than to understand what has happened to your son. This sort of thing has happened before. Your son is conscious, and as we understand, he will only talk to his brother here. We want to use Harry to ask Dennis our questions. We believe this would work best if he and Harry were alone. We've got the theater wired so we can hear the answer." My parents didn't say anything for a while. My father broke the silence with weak, staggered words. "Do you think he might come back? I know that even if he does, it won't be for long, but I'd really like him to come back for however long I didn't say enough. I wasn't big enough to say the things we had to say to each other. If such a thing is possible, I swear we will do everything in our power to make it happen. We've prepared a private waiting room for you two." Cohen's gestured down to the turn in the hallway. There were two people standing in white scrubs there, Pete and Shirley. will lead you there. If you would please go with them." My parents began to shuffle down the corridor, my mother still buried in my father's side. My father kept throwing looks back over his shoulder at me like he was afraid I'd vanish as soon as they were gone. I felt Cohen's hand come down on my shoulder. I turned around to him and he knelt down, so we were closer to being level. "I know this is very hard on you. I know this must be the worst day of your life. But do you think?" You're up to a quick history lesson I couldn't bring myself to answer properly, but some curiosity managed to rise through the delirium and shock, and I nodded. Cohen smiled. "One of the most significant moments of human history was the moon landing, and it's not even the fact itself that it was so important. It's that we had contact with them the whole time that they were up there. They were sending radio signals back to Earth and could be talked to. Do you think the moon landing would be what it was if we didn't have that type of connection to our men as they strode the unsettling and inhospitable surface of a place we were never meant to have knowledge of? What if they'd just gone up and never came back? What if we knew for sure that they got there but had no signal from them?" I was still quite out of it, so I can't say I was properly digesting all of this. I slurred out, "I don't know. They didn't know if they could get the astronauts back. It was a very real possibility that they'd be left to die up. They're stranded yet they still did it. It didn't matter if the mission was a failure. It didn't matter if there was no triumphant return. Do you know what mattered? What mattered more than anything was speaking to them while they were up there to have that connection to three brave men in the void, describing man's first step into the unknown. If they'd never come back, it wouldn't have changed anything. As long as we down here managed to make the connection to that beyond, as long as we down here for however long had men up there, men to describe the soil, men to explain the feeling of being so light, men to tell us what Earth looked like, cut in half by the lunar horizon, men to teach us about a new world." His hand tightened on my shoulder. None of that would have been possible without the people in Houston, without the men who talked to the astronauts, kept them focused, made sure we got the information we needed. "Harry, we believe Dennis is in a very strange place that humanity would do well to learn about. You are Houston. Your brother is an astronaut. He pulled a laminated sheet out from under his lapel. Here's a sheet with some topics you should focus on and questions you should ask. This should help you get the most useful and needed information. But the most important thing is to keep him talking. Stop talking for 5 seconds and you could lose him." I accepted the card, having given up on reaching a decent understanding of the situation. He ushered me inside the operating theater and shut the door behind me. I was alone. The only sound and almost inaudible ringing that emanated from the mass of stainless steel racks and implements and the cold, sturdy operating table Dennis was lying on. I approached the table and, in need of any sort of guidance, I looked at the laminated sheet. General principles: try to keep your loved one, the subject, unaware of their deceased state. Past experience suggests that the shock may cause disconnection. Maintain constant conversation, as this has been shown to help. Maintain the connection. Do not ask leading questions such as whether your loved one or the subject is having experiences in line with your own religious beliefs. First step: ask your loved one, the subject, to describe their experiences and/or surroundings. Encourage them to be. As I pulled my attention away from the sheet, Harry Dennis said, "Yes, it's me," I answered, grabbing his hand. There was now no doubt that he was really dead The hand was ice cold, and the fingers had locked in place at odd angles with rigor mortis. His entire body had gone from the sickly white of the dying to the rain cloud shade of the dead. I got to the gray, to the ground, came down easy like a leaf and cold. I'm standing there now. The house's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my connection, a truth that followed me to the voice. The air froze with a dread no hope should face, its currents weaving secrets through the dim space, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the table, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Metal, decay, something lost, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my terror. The room stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to fear, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The dread deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like warnings, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the edge. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the house was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the house's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my resolve, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a brother, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of lives spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd been here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to truth, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. Dennis, can you describe where you are? It's still gray, but it's more real now. I'm solid gray, sand underneath, gray ocean behind me, gray clouds above. Don't remember going through the clouds, but they're there now. The clouds, they're screaming in ocean, I said. Can you see anything in the ocean? Dennis took in a phlegmy, pointless breath. Far, far away. The horizon, it's getting dark. Dark, hungry line where even clouds stop, where everything stops. Darkness is clawing, moving like it's alive. Miles and miles of angry, hungry dark. Can't go there, can't go that way. At this point, I lost the thread of the exchange as perspective suddenly hit all the things I didn't understand, and the fact that whatever Dennis was, he wasn't alive. I broke crying and wailing and digging my face into his bare, emaciated ribs. Cold, like meat straight out of the fridge, I kept squeezing his hand harder and harder, pushing the stiff fingers closer together. Dennis, please come back. Please, wherever you are, just get back here. Harry, Are you crying? It's hard to tell so much here. Already sounds like crying. His words struck me deep enough to make my sobs catch in my throat, and I just started looking at him again, settling back to my previous catatonic distance from what was happening. I can't come back, no getting back like spilling something on the ground. No getting it all back inside. And right again, it took a few seconds to force myself to accept this, but I carried on hoping that maybe I could steer him towards some sign that he was wrong. What's in the other direction? Away from the ocean. That's the way I have to go. If I try to swim, the darkness will tear me up. Just R away everything until only my pain is left, and it'll toss that into the clouds, and I'll scream. Dennis, tell me what's in the other direction. Just the sand, the gray sand, on and on. Not many bad things yet, not many bad things to see. Yet there will be more when I get where I'm going. I'm going to start walking now, Harry. Where are you meant to? Be going, I said. I started digging my nails anxiously into my forearm. There was something nauseatingly, dreadfully true about everything he was saying. It was like the first time you learned the world is round, and it feels weird for a few seconds. But soon you get used to the idea, and you see, it's the truth. That's the big secret. And it doesn't matter how flat the ground feels, doesn't matter how little sense it makes. It's true. And he just kept talking. I can see another person. Can you talk to them? I said, trying to keep my voice steady, feeling like I shouldn't be the one who couldn't keep it together. I suppose I could, but I can't. What do you mean? It's just not a talking kind of place we were supposed to have done. All of our talking before we came here, now we should just keep quiet. But you're talking to me, Dennis. But my voice isn't here. It's all the way up there with you, Dennis, I said, now squeezing my eyes to force the tears back in Dennis. Please tell me what's happening. I think I finally died. And what's happening now is what happens next, the thing that was always going to happen next. It feels right in a scary way. It's been expecting me for so long, since before I was even a fuzzy little thing that might happen, since before our parents and their parents, and so far back, it's been expecting me. Please, please stop talking like that. You don't talk like that. You never have. Sorry. You just sort of see things different here. Some things you know without ever being told. Some things you forget. I couldn't think of anything to say and started to worry, remembering that if I left the pauses too long, he could stop answering. Hey, said Dennis, and the edges of his mouth strained out awkwardly, imitating a smile. I see a few more people, and they're all naked, but really naked. Their clothes are off, and they're all gray and wrinkly, but that's not it. You can kind of see inside them, like all the walls have fallen down, and you can see who they are. All their thoughts and feelings just kind of hanging around them like ghosts. It's like someone pulled the clothes off their whole past. They're so naked, Harry. He made a light coughing sound that was meant to be a laugh. That's really scary. Oh, I thought you might have thought it was funny. I don't think we're going to laugh at the same stuff anymore. I think you're different now. I guess that makes sense. So, what are the people doing? Most of them are moving the same direction as me, towards the center. The house's pulse was a weight. Its whispers, a truth that lingered in my dread, a truth that followed me to the gray. The air shattered with a whisper no soul should carry, its currents weaving secrets through the dim space, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I knelt by the table, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Metal, sorrow, something lost, something that clung to my soul, something that knew my despair. The room stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to loss, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The weight deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like fates, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the edge. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I glanced back, the space stretching behind, its surface bending as if the house was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my mind, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the house's pulse a drumbeat under my breath, its silence a predator. I carried my acceptance, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a brother, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze faded, the room a canvas of lives spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd been here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to memory, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. The center of what it's just called the center. The center of this place may be the center of everything, but what I said, starting to lose control. Why do you have to go? I don't have to. Nobody has to, just like when you don't have to shake someone's hand when they put it out or answer them when they talk to you, but it would feel wrong not to. It's what you're meant to do. And there's not any other good options. You don't want to stand still. What happens when you stand still depends. A few days ago, I passed this woman a few days. I said, dripping the cold steel of the operating table as I was filled with an eerie sense of vertigo. You haven't been dead for even a day. I passed her a few days ago, he said. Carrying on like he hadn't heard me, she didn't reach the center. She just sat down and started going her own way. She pulled one side of her rib cage out, and it's all stretched, spreading up to her left, so high, stretching out the arm, grabbing its corner. Most of her skin started to get hard and flaky, like old wood, her crumbling stone. I can see her self-musician like music, kind of her life like a song. Sometimes it repeated itself, some bad notes here and there, but it was pulling itself together. She was reaching the chorus, and it ended. It was over so fast, and she can't accept it. She picked this sharp rock off the ground. She's scraping it past her ribs like a huge harp or something. Angry, trying to make music keep the song going. But it's an awful sound sawing bone. It's never going to replace what should have come next. She's already grown into the ground. She's going to be here forever, trying to make the music she missed out on. There was nothing to say to that, so I just went quiet for a while, assuming he'd keep talking. He didn't. Dennis, no answer. A terrified jolt ran through me, and I started slamming my fist onto his chest. "Dennis, come back, Dennis!" A growl tore out of his mouth, and his frames thrashed upwards, causing me to jump back and tumble down onto the floor, smashing into the surgeon shelves and causing gleaming surgical instruments to rain down around me. I didn't have time to think before I forced myself up and bent over the operating table to stare desperately into my brother's eyes. I took his hand again, squeezing it as hard as I could. "Harry," he said, and relief flooded through me. "It's been so long, so long. It's been years. What, I've been walking for years and years, and it keeps getting worse. It hasn't been a day. It's been so many years, and everything keeps getting worse. What's worse? It gets worse. Closer to the center, there's so many people, thousands, tens of thousands. They're all walking to the center. But what's so horrible? There's more, so many more, like the girl with the harp I told you about, stuck in place trying to fix what happened, angry about what happened, rooted to the ground, moaning, calling out names of the people they think did this to them. Sometimes a few join up, and when they get all hard and crackly like old statues, they start to grow together, start to feel each other's pain. Sometimes there's mountains of them, entire landscapes of people crying about how unfair it all is. I'm still walking. But where are you going? I told you the center. I'm getting close now. All the clouds with their screaming faces are curving, all curving and being pulled in the same direction, twisting their way into the center. Please, just stop walking and come back. I can't. No, coming back. Besides, I have to keep moving like everyone else, doing something weird. It's the quickest way for the walkers to notice you. Oh, God, what are the walkers started seeing them more as I got towards the center. They're all over the place now. There are these things walk around on 3 legs like stilts covered in sharp black shells like thorns. Remember the aquarium, the kind of like those urchins we saw at the aquarium. But the top part, the main part, it's more exact, kind of arty, like a sculptor designed the shape. Reminds me of some kind of chess piece. When they notice you, when they come over, you toppling towards you, but never falling over on those long legs, spindly. Yeah, that's what you'd say, they spindly legs, and they stop right over you. You're just between their legs, and you see the holes underneath their main bit. The tendrils come out red windy, tendrils with these itchy hairs come down, and they start curling and swinging all around you. You almost don't mind at first, because they're red. You've been seeing nothing but gray and black for years, and the tendrils are red, and it's beautiful. But then they touch you, and it's awful. Every bad thing you've ever felt, every bad thing that's ever happened to you starts bubbling up to the surface, drowning you. All the pain that ever went into you rises up and down, and the walkers feed on it. They lick it with their tendrils. They love the taste of all the things that shouldn't have happened. They love the taste of misery. Eventually, they get full and move on, and you get up and keep walking. Jesus, dance, Jesus, it's fine. They're bad. But you get a sense of perspective here. Sure, they're scary for you, but they are nothing next to the center. They're bottom feeders, moss that grew on the outskirts. If they're really like sea urgent, then the center must be like a shark or a whale or some huge thing right at the bottom of the sea that's too big to come up near the surface. You've never said things like this before. I don't know how to describe it. When you're here, stuff just breaks down a little, and you don't always need to have learned a word to know it this place. Story number 3, The Confession of a Fallen God. You sit in a quiet church. the weight of years heavy on your shoulders, when a voice speaks from the shadows, a voice that claims to be God, do you listen or walk away? What if the voice isn't lying? What if it confesses sins so vast they shatter everything you believe? Would you dare to absolve a God? The air grows thick, the silence broken by sounds that shouldn't exist, horns that shake the soul. Something's coming, and it's not from this world. Have you ever felt faith crumble, not from doubt, but from a truth too terrible to accept? That day I heard it, and it broke me. What do you do when the divine admits it's flawed, hunted, and afraid? When the heavens are gone, and something ancient is closing in? When you've been a priest for as long as I have, you start to notice patterns in people. 38 years in the confessional had taught me to read them, their hesitations, their averted gazes. When a parishioner approaches, I can already guess what they want to ask me by their body language or the way their eyes flicker to meet mine. It was almost a game, predicting their sins before they spoke. It's quite funny, actually. Everyone thinks they're unique, that somehow they're different than everyone else. But they weren't. Well, let me tell you, after 38 years of hearing confessions, I've come to the conclusion that we're all pretty much identical. Lust, greed, pettiness, over and over, a monotonous cycle. If I have to listen to one more trembling voice confess to watching pornography, I might just lose my mind. Now I haven't turned cynical in my old age, just weary. The repetition wore me down, each confession blending into the next. When you hear the same sins repeated over and over again 1,000 million times over, you begin to wonder if there's any hope left for the human race. Faith was supposed to be the answer. I guess that's where faith kicks in though now. I'm not sure how much of that faith I still possess. I'd given up the collar, walked away from the church. You see, I don't practice anymore. I've given up the collar. Something broke me, something I couldn't unhear. I witnessed something that has shaken me to this day, and the shadow of its memory still haunts me. It was the last confession I ever took. The church was dim, the air heavy with incense and silence. I stifled a yawn, trying my best to remain awake after another sobbing parishioner left the confessional. The booth was cramped, the cushion under me worn thin. The entire process had just become so mechanical to me that I barely even heard what was being whispered on the other side of the screen. My body ached, my patience frayed. I adjusted the cushion under my rear, feeling the familiar ache that had only gotten worse as my years advanced. Time dragged, each confession a weight. I closed my eyes and offered it up to the Lord, begging Him to fill me with patience for these people. I heard the familiar sound of wood on the other side of the screen as yet another sinner took their place. The booth creaked, and I braced myself. I ran a hand over my weary eyes and then spoke into the screen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I recited, making the sign of the cross. A man's voice answered, low and rough. A male voice spoke to me from the other side. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession. I shifted, trying to focus. I shifted the cushion beneath me, annoyed at the distraction, and tried my best to focus on the man. His voice was different, raw, unsteady. Do not be afraid, my son. Tell the Lord what you have done. The man said nothing for a moment, his voice rasping behind the screen. Father, I don't think there's any hope for me. I've done so much. I leaned forward, alert, and I sat up a little straighter, my son. There is no sin too great for God. He choked back a sob. The man struggled to keep his emotions in check, his voice straining. I think I've broken every rule in the book: deception, greed, lust, murder, everything. Murder! The word hit like a stone. The mention of murder sent a cold icicle shooting up my back. My voice tightened. You killed someone, I asked, voice hardening. This was new, uncharted. This was a serious confession, one I'd never heard before in all my years in the booth. I could hear the man begin to fall apart, shame and grief washing his words in sorrow. I've killed so many people. My pulse quickened. My heart was racing in my chest. Who have you killed? When was this? His voice broke. The man sniffled. It was a long time ago. I've been on the run for a long time. I don't know what to do anymore. My whole life has been a lie. One big fake advertisement for something I was never equipped to be. I pressed closer to the screen, my voice firm. I leaned into the screen, voice stern. Have you thought about turning yourself into the police coming clean? Will surely ease the weight of your sins. His pain was palpable. I can hear it in your voice, your suffering. The man started crying. You have no idea. I softened, trying to guide him. I knew I had to be delicate here, son. The Lord's love is endless. He can forgive you of these transgressions if you show him how truly sorry you are. His response was a sharp laugh, bitter and raw. The man surprised me by barking a laugh. His love isn't endless, nor is it unconditional. I swallowed, unsettled. I swallowed, treading carefully. I know it's hard to understand, to accept, especially when you're feeling so low. But hear me, nothing is too great for the Lord. I spoke of divine love, vast and forgiving. His wisdom and love for you is deeper than the oceans, broader than the universe. He wants you to know that, to feel that in your soul. But his next words turned my world upside down. A confession I couldn't fathom. The man was recovering, and he snorted behind the screen. You couldn't be more wrong. His tone was certain, defiant. Slightly frustrated, I pressed him. What makes you say that? Then his voice boomed, shaking the booth. Suddenly, the man's voice filled the entire booth, a deep rumble that shook me to the very core of my soul. Because I am your Lord. I froze, my mind reeling. I blinked, my head spinning. This was new. Just what kind of person was I dealing with here? Was he mad? Delusional? I suddenly realized that the mental state of this person could be seriously compromised. I decided to play along, cautiously. After a moment, I decided to play along a little longer. You're the Lord. I can hear the doubt in your voice. Oh, yes. I sniffled. Well, forgive me if I am a little cautious around someone who proclaims they are the Son of God. He cut me off, irritated. There is no Son of God, the man said, irritated. It's just me. You guys made up all that Jesus. I had nothing to do with that. My thoughts spun, grappling with his word. My mind was spinning as I tried to keep up. Okay, so who are you really? And what are you doing in my confessional? He exhaled, heavy with weariness. The man exhaled. He had just told you who I am, and I'm here to make peace before I die. or whatever happens to me after. I don't really know how I die. I never thought about it before. I tried to steer him back to sanity. I decided it was time to start steering the ship back on course. When a soul dies in the good graces of God, it gets sent to heaven. The man laughed. Good graces. Yeah, look, you're wrong. You're all wrong. His voice turned dark. What are you talking about? I asked, feeling anger begin to stir in my chest. He spoke softly, chillingly. The man's voice dropped low. Heaven is gone. I raised an eyebrow, his certainty unnerving. I cocked an eyebrow, the seriousness in his voice giving me pause. What do you mean, gone? His voice rumbled again. His tone remained the same. It got wiped out a long time ago. There is nothing left. A cold dread settled in my stomach. For reasons unexplainable, I began to feel uneasy. A sinking dread that was just beginning to form in my stomach. How is that possible? God is almighty, and the devil can never best him, I said. He slammed his hand against the wall, startling me. The man slammed his hand against the wall, causing me to jump. There is no devil, there never was. I don't know where you people got that, but it wasn't from me. His words were a blade cutting through my beliefs. There is just myself and heaven. No angels, no saints, nothing. I created a place for you, and I created a place for me. He described a heaven for himself, a place to watch humanity. Then I sat around and watched my creations from the comfort of my own home, my heaven. Every once in a while I poke my finger in and stir up some cause of disaster or something just to see how you'd react. His confession grew darker, a God admitting to cruelty, to chaos. If heaven is good, where do our souls go when we die? I asked. His answer was blunt. I have no idea. I don't even know if you have a soul. I certainly didn't give you one. Why would I? He saw us as playthings. I made you so I could have something to do. When you die, 3 more people take your place, and I watched the circus go round and round. Yet he marveled at us. But I have to say I'm impressed with the human race. You've all come such a long way. I never dreamed you'd create such wonders. Bravo, the man said. A crash echoed outside, ignored in my focus. Something outside the booth in the sanctuary crashed, but I ignored it. The man drawing all my attention. Why are you here? I repeated, mind blanking at the absurdity of what I was hearing. His voice softened, edged with fear. The man's voice turned quiet, an edge of unease now. Because I am going to die soon. I can't hide down here much longer. They know where I am, and they're getting so close. My heart raced. Who? The man collected himself before speaking the old horns. Footsteps shuffled outside, but I was transfixed. I could hear the shuffling of feet echoing outside the booth as people began to leave, probably annoyed at the long confessional, but I didn't care. His words held me. Something about this man held me and terrified me. I'm not following. I said, a worm of unease snaking up my stomach into my chest. I thought you said there was just you and us. I thought you said that devil didn't exist. He hissed, urgent. He doesn't. This is something else entirely. The man hissed. I wanted to end this, but couldn't. The logical part of me begged to end this conversation, but I couldn't let it go. What do they want with you, the old horns? Fear crept into his voice. Fear. entered the man's voice. I don't know, they just showed up in heaven one day, taking me completely by surprise. They destroyed everything. Their power was unimaginable. Their power and wrath was more furious than anything I'd ever seen before. I had no choice. I ran. You ran and came to earth, I asked. He had nowhere else. I had to. Where else is there to go? I don't know anywhere else but your world and mine. He was lost, hunted. I don't have a clue where these entities came from or how they found me or why they want me, but there is no stopping them. They'll be here soon. I can't hide forever. I tried to make sense of it. I exhaled, trying to collect my thoughts. Okay, so say, hypothetically, this is all true. Why would you come here to confession? If you're God, what do you need to apologize for? His voice broke. The man was silent for a moment, then said softly, Isn't this what you're supposed to do before you die? He was scared. A god trembling before his end, confessing to a mortal. Truth be told, I have no idea what will happen to me when they catch up, but I'm scared. I'm really scared. His vulnerability shook me. I've done a lot of bad things, and this just seemed like the right thing to do. He trailed off miserably. He admitted to horrors. I'm not the all-loving, wonderful God humanity thinks I am. I've done things to you people that sickens me. He took blame for history's worst moments. I don't know why I did them, but I did. You can look back on history and probably pick out the events that I had a hand in. They're pretty obvious. Humanity's pain was his doing. You know how people always say, why would God let that happen? Well, it's because I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all I've made you people go through. You didn't deserve it. I just kept pushing the envelope, and you Christians never lost faith in me. You always found ways to make sense of it all, always giving me the glory I didn't deserve it. I'm so sorry. His words crushed me, heavy with guilt. I didn't say anything. The weight of his words collapsing in on me like the walls of a cave, trapping me in their conviction. How could this be true? How could I believe any of this? It was nonsense, and yet another crash echoed in the sanctuary. And this time I took notice because it filled the silence. Fear stirred. Oh, no. I heard the man whisper, fear stirring his voice. What's wrong? I asked quietly. I heard the shuffle of a curtain and then the sound of wood. They're here. My stomach dropped. I swallowed hard. Ooh, the old horn. Something dropped into the pit of my stomach, and I was suddenly very on edge. My hand hovered over the curtain, one hand resting on the curtain in front of me. Don't open it. Do not look at them, the man hissed. I froze, voice shaking. Why? I whispered, my voice unsteady. Now just don't, he said urgently. His fear was contagious. My time here is done. I am at the end of my road. Stay in your booth, Father, until you hear the silence again. It will be safe then. This is insane, I whispered. There's nothing out there. But I couldn't move. The man leaned into the screen, his voice earnest. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but please have faith in me one last time. My hand trembled. My hand remained frozen. My sweaty fingers plastered to the curtain. I was paralyzed, torn between the madness of his story and the horrific sinking feeling I felt in my chest. He begged for absolution. Please, absolve me of my sins, and I'll leave you alone forever. the man begged, now voice shaking. A scraping sound echoed out. Mind spinning, I released the curtain and turned to the screen. Something moved outside the booth. A scraping sound across the marble floors. I made the sign of the cross and, voice trembling, I absolve you of your sins and go in peace. My voice was barely a whisper. The man exhaled heavily, relief filling him. Thank you, Father. Thank you. Then it came, a sound like no other. Suddenly, a noise blasted through the church, so loud I had to cover my ears, my heart leaping into my throat. A low, bone-rattling horn. It was the blast of a low horn, a long single note that rattled me to the bone. Sweat dripped down my face. As the sound faded, a drop of sweat ran down my face. What in the hell? It's time, the man said. I pressed against the screen, desperate. Wait, I cried, pressing my face against the screen. Don't go out there, please. His voice softened, resigned. The man's voice softened. Maybe this is how it's supposed to be. He spoke of love, flawed but real. I never sent anyone to die on a cross for your sins, but I do love you. I love all of you, and I can't thank you enough for keeping me company all of these years. You truly are incredible people. God bless you, Father. The curtain rustled as he left. Then I heard the curtain rustle as he stepped out into the sanctuary. His footsteps echoed away from me. The church shook with another horn, and I knew he was gone, facing something I couldn't comprehend. I slammed my hands over my ears again as another horn sounded. My breath blew sour across my tongue, and I sat panting, waiting, sweat rolling down my spine. His voice faded, muffled, speaking to something unseen. I heard the man speaking to something, but I couldn't understand him. His voice muffled. I fought the urge to look. My hands clenched my pants, and every part of me screamed to look, but I resisted, teeth grinding together as I squeezed my eyes shut. I counted, desperate for focus. I began to count in my head, desperately needing to focus on something. 1, 2, 3, 4. Another horn blasted, shaking the booth. Another ear-splitting horn sounded off the low notes so loud I heard the confessional booth creak against the blast. Fed 6, 7, 8, 9. I opened my eyes. I had just felt something change, something in the air. A shift in energy, a draining of something that was no longer there. The air was empty, lifeless. I sat panting for a few moments longer, then let out a long breath, releasing the tension I had been holding inside of me. I reached for the curtain, trembling. Cautiously, I reached out and grasped the curtain in front of me. I stood, my old bones sighing, and dragged a shaking hand across my brow. I stepped out. I opened the curtain. The sanctuary stood empty. The church was silent. The man gone. Not long after that, I gave up the cloth. I just couldn't do it anymore. The weight of that day was too much. Something about that day shook me to the very essence of my being. I tried to share it, but no one understood. I've discussed the event with a couple of their priests, and they just don't understand. I don't blame them. My story sounded insane. When I recite my story, it sounds like the ramblings of a madman who would alter their life so drastically based on a one interaction, especially considering the circumstances. But I did. But I have, and I don't regret it. Something about prayer just feels so empty now. I don't know what's going to happen when I die. In truth, no one does. But that day was real. But what I do know is what I felt that day inside the confessional that was real. It wasn't just words, it was a presence, a truth I couldn't deny. When I strip away everything else, all of the questions and oddities that twist in my gut is what remains. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it. I can't explain what I witnessed. I can't rationalize the bizarre sounds I heard. I can't reenact to the conviction I heard in that man's voice. But it changed me. But I was there, and it was real, and that is what I have put my faith into. The church felt different after that, hollow, like it had lost something vital. I left, unable to carry the weight of the collar any longer. I've spent years trying to piece it together, searching old texts, local legends, anything that might explain those horns, that man. Some speak of ancient entities, older than the heavens, but the stories are vague, fragmented. I don't know if he was God or something else entirely, but his fear was real. And it stayed with me. Every night I hear echoes of those horns in my dreams, and I wonder if they're still out there, searching for what's left of him or us.